In the early years of Mountain Empire Community College, the Slimp Foundation would provide money for a guest speaker of great prestige to come and give a talk in I believe it was usually in the spring, but I'm not sure about that. One of the earliest speakers was Alex Haley, the author of Roots, who retired in Clinton, Tennessee, and he came up and gave a talk at Mountain Empire, which is the basis for what I have been doing as a hobby for the last 30 years, which is writing local history. In that talk, somebody asked him, why did you bother to write Roots? He, of course, was a black man, and he said, blacks don't know their heritage. They don't know their history. And any group of people that doesn't know their heritage or their history is disadvantaged. So I wrote Roots in order to help them know their heritage and so they wouldn't be disadvantaged. And he says, my next project is going to be to write a book on, he didn't use the word, but hillbillies. I'll use the word ridge runner. I am one, so I can use the terms freely. He says, these people don't know who they are. They don't know their heritage. So I'm going to write about them and empower them like I have for the blacks. Now that rang a bell with me because I hadn't thought about it, but I knew that the man was absolutely right. He died before he got around to writing that book. And I have not written it in book form, but in a series of essays. I have tried to fulfill that need that Alex Haley saw. So this talk, officially, I'm giving today is on the French and Indian War. There has never been a book, believe it or not, written on Virginia in the French and Indian War. That happened to be in the formative period for this area here, covered by Mountain Empire Community College. So I decided to do that. And it's what this talk is today, except it's expanded to the largest legitimate extent that you could use. Where did the French and Indian War have its origins? How did it get started? And what influence did it have on us here in the Mountain Empire? That raised a larger issue is that people worldwide have never really conceptualized or comprehended what the American frontier was like. Britain, for instance, would draw one line after another, north to south across the map, and say the frontier is here. Frontier actually was 1,000 miles deep. It doesn't mean that the Europeans occupied it, but the results of their activities along the coast resonated all the way to the end of the Great Lakes, all the way to the Mississippi River. And I would even point out that it actually went all the way to the Rocky Mountains. So I'll begin my story. It begins in an unlikely place. It begins in the Pyrenees Mountains, which are the mountains that form the border between France and Spain. The people that live there are a special people. They're not related to either the Spanish or the French. Nobody really knows where they came from. They're called the Basques. And people argue about their language, which is so old that it doesn't seem to be related to any other language. Their DNA today is still a subject of debate and dispute. At any rate, the Basques had their own special language. And they also started killing whales. Whales would swim up and down the coast of France, the Bay of Biscay, which is the bay between France and Britain. And they would see a whale spouting out off the coast, and they would jump in their rowboats and go out and harpoon it and haul it ashore and harvest it. And they made their living making whale oil, which was used for lighting all through Europe. and meat, which the Europeans ate. Now the Continental Shelf runs from France all the way to Ireland, and even in the Ice Age, when people were inhabiting Europe, people could walk from continental Europe across England all the way to Ireland. That continental shelf was a great home for codfish. The Basques learned how to codfish and had to whale. They invented those industries. They were so good at it that there began to be a problem with the whales that began to diminish in numbers. So as that situation evolved, the Basque whaling industry evolved, and they built bigger and bigger ships and chased the whales further and further into sea. And as they were chasing the whales further and further away, they found out that the whales swam between the continental shelf on the Bay of Biscay and the Outer Banks, which is between Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. So they kept chasing the whales, and one day they were surprised. They wound up on the coast of Labrador and Newfoundland before Columbus. And you can harvest a whale on board ship. You can haul it on board ship and make it marketable. You can make whale oil out of it and whale meat. But you can't do that for codfish. Codfish industry, you have to dry a cod on wooden racks over a fire and with lots and lots of salt. The way you make salt in those days was to cut firewood and boil seawater, and you had to be on shore to do it. So the Basques were the first folks in North America, and they kept it a secret because, just like people today, if you find a fine fishing hole, you won't tell anybody about it. The Europeans noted that the Basque fishing fleet would disappear along the western horizon and come back a year later with their boats laden with whale oil and whale meat. This was recorded in a highly regarded history written by a Frenchman named Argentin. And he came along about 50 years after Columbus sailed into the Caribbean. Now, it's well known, the Basques settled officially in Newfoundland in recorded history about half a dozen years after Columbus. And they discovered, the French discovered, that the Basques were well habituated to Newfoundland. And they also noted that the Aboriginal inhabitants of Newfoundland, called the Beothuk, were mostly dead, and they were dying from tuberculosis, which of course is an old world disease, and you don't die from tuberculosis immediately. You take 20 or 30 years to do it. So these Beothuks were dying from something they had caught 20 or 30 years earlier. They had to catch it from old world people, and this was, if you do the math, this confirms that they were there before Columbus. And the Beothuks all died. Now, Newfoundland became a Basque colony, and the language that was the lingua franca, the common language that everybody communicated by, was a Basque pidgin. And it went all the way from Labrador through Newfoundland, through the Maritimes, through New England, and into New York State. Now that would blow your mind. It's not the history you were taught in school, but Basques were the dominant influence in that large portion of North America. And almost certainly smallpox had been there before tuberculosis. While tuberculosis may take 20 years to kill you, smallpox kills you within weeks. The North American Aborigines, the Indians, and the Eskimos had no genetic experience to smallpox. It killed 95% of the native population of North America. So the Beothuks probably were well on the way out of here when the Basques got here and gave them tuberculosis. But these issues is what originally destabilized the North American Indian population. 95% of those died, and they didn't all die in unison. It depended on how they came into contact with the Old World people. And the next thing that happened was the Dutch settled New York, and they began competing with the French in Quebec for beaver fur, which was used to make hats, which was the fad in Europe at the time. And the Indians started killing all the beaver they could in order to trade it to the Europeans, the Dutch and the French, for firearms and firewater, alcohol. And the Beaver Wars started. The Indians in New England began to compete with the Indians from the Gaspé Peninsula, which is on the south bank of the St. Lawrence, for this vast country of swamplands between Maine and Gaspé. And the Beaver Wars broke out among the Indian tribes. And not only were they dying from European diseases, but they began to kill each other in the competition for beaver fur, the Beaver Wars. And this is what the last of the Mohegans was all about. The Mohegans were wiped out by European diseases, and they were deeply involved in the Beaver Wars. They were killed by other Indians. So let's talk a little bit about the Indian tribes as they were settled in that time. The major Indian tribes in this portion of North America can be divided into two different linguistic groups, the Algonquin and the Iroquoian. Iroquoian, by the way, the word is a Basque pidgin word for the group of Indians who were a common linguistic group who lived basically south of Lake Ontario in the Mohawk River Valley, which runs from Buffalo to Albany. And the important other thing that this was a linguistic group is that all these Iroquoian Indians were matrilineal, which has had tremendous significance in our area. In other words, the women ruled the roost, the women were head of the family, their husbands came and went very informally, and the kids belonged to the mother. They're part of the mother's clan, part of the mother's family. This is part of the culture here. Now, the main Iroquoian tribes were and are today the Seneca that lived in Buffalo, the Oneida, which lived down at the headwaters of the Mohawk River, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Mohawk. Mohawk lived at Albany on the junction of the Mohawk River with the Hudson River. Now, there were three other tribes that were originally part of that group, major tribes, lots of smaller tribes. And those were the Hurons that we would know in Big Stone Gap as the Wyandot, and the Catawbas, and another group that lived out in that moved to the Tidewater of North Carolina. And long about the time that all this history began to be recorded, there was a major explosion. We don't know the nature of it, we can guess, among the Iroquoian Indians. Originally, all these folks, there were 7 major tribes, and they all just kind of exploded. The Hurons moved from New York to southern Ontario. Another name, as I say, is the Wyandot. You can see they had a connection with us here. The Catawbas moved to the main part of North Carolina, the Yadkin Valley, which is where Winston-Salem and Raleigh-Durham are. And then this semi-mythic character named Hiawatha, he's historic, but he's mythic, got the remaining tribes and they formed a confederacy, which is the political origins of the United States of America. They formed a 5-nation, later 6-nation. The Tuscaroras from Tidewater, North Carolina, at the time of the Revolution, went back and rejoined the Iroquois Confederacy, and it became Six Nation. And that Confederacy was the role model, conscious role model, among the Europeans when they formed the Articles of Confederation after the Revolution, which evolved into the present United States. The Indian tribes running along the present Canadian-United States border moved to the west like a bunch of dominoes. One tribe would push the tribe to its west, which would push the tribe to its west. And this dominoes effect went all the way to the Rocky Mountains. The Blackfoot are at Browning, Montana, which is the entrance to Glacier National Park. They originally started out in the Black Hills of South Dakota. Now the Hurons I spoke of occupied southern Ontario, and they had the biggest pitched battle among Indians in the entire North America was in 1740, and it's between the Ojibwe, which we haven't mentioned, and the Mohawk, which moved into southern Ontario, and it was fought at a lake in southern Ontario called Lake Kashagawigamog in 1740. The Ojibwe won the battle, but decided that they would better move out anyway, so they lost the war. And you can find Ojibwe today in reservations in Montana and in southern Alberta. Now the Sioux live north of Lake Ontario, of Lake Superior, and they were run out all the way to the Dakotas, North and South Dakota. Dakota and Lakota and Sioux are all the same tribe. So you can see how that went. Now, there was another tribe, Shenanton, who were a confederacy of 20 tribes that lived between Lake Fort Erie, which is the Canadian side of Buffalo, all the way to Niagara Falls and on down the north side of Lake Ontario. They were politically weak, but became very important to us here. They maintained neutrality between the Hurons to the north and to the Iroquois to the south. And the reason they were able to do this is they owned a very fine vein of flint back in the days when all the Indians' weapons were flint tipped. And they traded flint both to the Hurons and to the Iroquois. And when the French came, they renamed them the Neutrals. And this worked out very well until the Dutch started selling whiskey and firearms to the Indians that were engaged in the Beaver Wars. And flint became less important, so the Seneca that lived in Buffalo went up and conquered the Neutrals. They killed all the men. They brought the women and children back to Buffalo. And the Neutrals became a repository for fragments of all the Indian tribes in New York and Pennsylvania that had shrunk. The Delaware were particularly, the Delaware are Algonquin speakers. Men are head of the family. And they got pretty well wiped out, and the residual bunch of Delaware joined the Neutrals, who were Seneca. The Seneca adopted them into the tribe. This was a survival strategy for all the Indian tribes who were dying from European diseases, was to try to get their numbers up by conquering somebody else. The chief of the Neutrals among the Senecas was a man named Logan, who was half French Canadian and half Delaware. We'll pick up that end of the story later. So all the Indian tribes in what's now the border country between Canada and the United States, reaching all the way down into Pennsylvania, were dying out and politically destabilizing and losing their culture. And excuse me, the French began to move down into what's now the United States. And we need to talk a little bit about geology. Before the last ice age, the New River, which begins in Boone, North Carolina, flowed north and entered what's now the Ohio. And the Ohio River was formed by a giant glacier, which was a mile thick, and formed a dam to the New River, which originally flowed backwards up what's now the Ohio, past Pittsburgh, and to the Allegheny, and the Allegheny connected with what's now the St. Lawrence. In other words, the river began at Boone, North Carolina, which is the largest river in North America, and became the St. Lawrence, which entered the ocean at the Outer Banks. And the glacier reversed this flow, and all the water went to Frankfort and turned down toward the Mississippi. But this dried up river system is still there. The old river system that connected the Allegheny River with Lake Erie. It's a very low, swampy country, and the headwaters of the creeks that flows into the Lake Erie is only about 15 miles away from the headwaters of the creeks that flows into the Allegheny. And the Indian could carry his canoe from Lake Erie and put it back in the water into the Allegheny and paddle it all the way to New Orleans. And this old archaic riverbed became the main way that the French built their empire into the interior of the United States. Now, we have no concept of how advanced they were. The English were involved in the 30 Years' War on Europe, which was between France and her allies and the Germans. And it was really draining the resources of Great Britain. Great Britain also got involved in their Civil War, which was 100 years in the making. So the French had a heyday, free reign in what's now Canada and the United States. And the French sent expeditions down this old river system and built forts along the way. They built their first fort at what now is Erie, Pennsylvania, where this creek system originated. They built Fort Le Boeuf, which is the French word for beef, which is what they call the buffalo. A really major fort built according to European specifications. They built another fort where the French Creek, which is the creek that flows into the Allegheny, is. And then they built Fort Duquesne, which is at Pittsburgh. And they went down the Ohio River and built St. Louis. They built Cape Girardeau, which is in Missouri. They built 2 or 3 more forts down the Mississippi. They built New Orleans. They built Mobile, and really a major system. And this was 3,000-mile empire that began at the mouth of the St. Lawrence and ended up in New Orleans. And they built forts in the Greenbrier Valley, which connects with the Potomac. And that got to be a sour point with the English, because the warpaths led from Tidewater, Virginia to Fort Duquesne, which became Fort Pitt, and led all the way up to France and led down the Ohio to New Orleans. So it's 3,000 miles long. And the French and the English began to compete for this country. England settled its Civil War. They got rid of their European wars. And King George II woke up one day and realized all his empire in North America was going to be taken by the French if he didn't watch out. So he sent the 22-year-old George Washington, along with a crew which included Christopher Gist, of whom the Gist River is named after, went up to Fort Le Boeuf to talk with the French and told them politely to get out or there would be war. And the French equally fed them well and politely told them we're not moving. So George Washington went back to Williamsburg, and they all agreed that this was not acceptable. So they gave Washington a colonel's commission and several hundred Virginia militiamen, and they went up toward Fort Duquesne. And the French sent down another commission. The French said it was a peace commission. The English and the Americans said it was a war invasion. And they met at the Great Meadows, which is just south of Pittsburgh. And the French the French were attacked by Mingo, which is a word we'll need to define. The Mingo was what the Dutch called the Iroquois. And somehow or another the name got switched until it meant this group of neutrals who had all these Delaware and other folks that were living with the Seneca. They became the Mingo. But that's the evolution of the name. But here you've got the Iroquois being under pressure between the developing English Empire and the French Empire. And the Iroquois had been Christianized by the English and were Protestant. The Mingo, having lived in Canada, and even though they were Iroquoian, had been Christianized by the French Jesuits. And here they were intermarried with the Seneca. And the Seneca perceived this to be a problem. They didn't trust the Mingo. They thought that they would go tell everything that the Iroquois were doing and the English were doing to the Jesuits in Quebec. So one day they went to Chief Logan and the Mingo and says, "We love you, we're intermarried with you, we don't trust you. You're going to have to leave. We'll not harm you, but you just leave and get out." So the Mingo gradually migrated to the area around Williamson, Pennsylvania. It's no accident that the two counties there are Logan County and Mingo County. And there they sat. So the French beat George Washington and the Virginia militia. So Washington and the Virginia militia went back to Virginia, and the English by this time, this history that I'm giving you occurred over a 2-year period, and it was 2 years before the Europeans realized all this was going on. That's because of the time it took to get across the Atlantic Ocean. But the English became very concerned. They were free of their Civil War, they were free of their Continental War, and they took 2 regiments of redcoats out of Ireland and gave them to General Braddock, who came to Virginia, and there were contingents of South Carolina militia, and Virginia being the major colony, the Virginia militia. And they were all going up this trail to Fort Duquesne to run the French off, particularly since the French had run Washington out. And General Braddock, being a hard-headed Englishman, followed English military doctrine to the letter. The English had learned in their Continental Wars that the best defensive maneuver was to form a square with all 4 sides facing outward, and the square was 3 tiers deep. And it just so happened that it takes, if 3 tiers fire one at a time, that's how long it takes to load a Brown Bess, which was the musket that the English used. So you had 3 tiers of musketeers on all 4 sides, and you stood there despite hail and high water. They beat Napoleon that way, the English infantry square. So Braddock was running up the trail toward Fort Duquesne, Pittsburgh, and like a European, he didn't need anybody else's opinion or views of anything. The only guards that he had out was 3 Mingo. The Mingo allied themselves with Braddock, but they only had 3 Indians out ahead of the column. And the French had all the Indians in the world, and the French knew that Braddock was coming, and they started down the trail from Pittsburgh. Braddock and the French and the Indians ran into each other about 6 miles south of what's now Pittsburgh. And the English immediately followed their traditional doctrine, and they formed infantry solid squares out in the middle of the road where they were out exposed to everybody. The French were better at, how shall I put it? They married into the Indians. The British would not, by and large. The French became Indianified culturally, and they had adopted the Indian style of fighting. They did away with the standing up out in the open and shooting each other that the Europeans did. So the French just melted down the woods beside Braddock and just began merrily a turkey shoot, shooting into the infantry squares. It's amazing that the British stood there for 3 hours and took this, and they were practically wiped out. The French and the Indians had only a half a dozen casualties. And Braddock was killed or shot, and George Washington and the Virginia militia took charge, and the Virginia militia and George Washington saved what's left of Braddock's hide. Interestingly enough, Daniel Boone's first job in the public sector was he was a teamster for Braddock. Daniel Boone cut the harnesses off his horses and made a run for it. And Washington formed a rear guard, took the still living Braddock, and the French and Indians fell on the English supply of rum, and that stopped the French and Indian pursuit. There were, I think, 40 barrels of rum that they captured. Braddock died, and Washington had him buried in the road, and the army marched over him till the Indians couldn't find his body and scalp it. And he got back to Virginia safely. The French and Indian War was initially pretty much a French victory. They built Fort Duquesne at Pittsburgh, which was a perfect European structure built with redoubts, and every wall could be covered by fire from another wall. I've got a diagram of it. It was a beautiful thing. Now the French took advantage of all this, and they occupied the Greenbrier Valley. Greenbrier Valley, by the way, is a translation of a French word, which is Ronceverte. And the English, when they captured Fort Duquesne, saw the French military drawings and maps of the Greenbrier Valley, which was labeled the Ronceverte. There's a town up near Louisburg that's named Ronceverte. And that's the origins of that. They also built a fort in Indiana on the Ohio River, which is called French Lick. And they went on down to New Orleans, we've spoken of, but they also came up the Cumberland River and to the place where the Natchez Trace intersected the Wilderness Road, and set up a fort there, which another place they call French Lick, which the English soon settled after the war, and it became Nashburgh and became Nashville. That's the origins of Nashville. And the French also sent a military contingent to Knoxville. Now what's now the French Broad River, was originally just the Broad River, and it was the northern border of the Cherokee Indians. Remember that the Cherokee, Tuscarora, and the Catawbas were all originally Iroquoian. And about the time Columbus was discovering the New World, this big explosion, which was probably European diseases, hit the Iroquois, and the Hurons went to Ohio, Tuscarora to New York, the Catawbas to North Carolina, and the Cherokee went to the Smokies. So the French built a fort on the ford of the Broad River, which is Knoxville, and it became known as the French Broad rather than just the Broad River. So here we were in Virginia. We had French in Pittsburgh, which they renamed Fort Duquesne Fort Pitt, which was the avenue to Canada if you followed this old prehistoric river. It was also, they had us on the southern side at Fort in Knoxville, and they had to the west in Nashville, and at French Lick in Indiana. So King George II became concerned, and his answer to this, Britain had another problem. Britain was full of refugees from the wars in Europe, particularly Germans. They had refugee camps built all over England and Ireland for all these Germans who were pietists who had been run out of Europe. And they got to be a burden to the English. The English had their own version of pietists, which were the Quakers, which were very influential because the Quakers, under their chief, William Penn, was in the British royal family. So the British had all these excess Germans they wanted to get rid of. They also had invented steam-driven weaving and spinning, and they had decided to take all of Scotland and start raising sheep rather than to have little bitty miniature farms, which were overgrown gardens called crofts. And they made war on the Scots, and all of a sudden they had a lot of excess Scots that had no means of support because they took the crofts away from them and turned them into sheep farms. And King George II says, well, I can get rid of all these problems at one maneuver. I'm going to settle the Great Valley of Virginia, the Shenandoah, with excess Germans and excess Scots. We don't like them anyway. They're subhuman. And they will serve as a buffer between the English and Tidewater and the French that's coming down from the north, and the Indians. And those Indians can kill all these Germans and Scots-Irish, and the English will be safe. It's literal truth, and they weren't coy about it at all. At the same time, all these Germans and had settled in Pennsylvania, and they got to be more of them than they could handle. And there's this mountain range to the west of Pennsylvania. You can't get through it except for the Ohio River. And the Ohio River freezes solid at that time in the winter. And people migrated in the winter because they had to close up the farms that they lived on in the east, and in the winter get to their new farm in the west and get it planted in time to have crops that next year. So people talk about the Ohio as a route of migration. It's greatly overstated because you could not use it because it was only open in the summer. So they had to come down the Valley of Virginia and hit the Wilderness Road, which went right through Lee County and Scott County and Cumberland Gap and Kentucky, and it opened up the Midwest. 300,000 of these folks walked through Cumberland Gap and settled the Midwest. The first folks to settle in the Valley of Virginia under this program of George II were the Germans, who were Mennonites, and they bought Rockingham County. If you realize it, that's still the center of Mennonite activities in the United States. Eastern Mennonite University is there in Harrisonburg. Lots of brethren moved in with these Mennonites. Now the Irish, who had also settled in Pennsylvania, tried to buy Rockingham County, but the Germans already had it, so as a second choice, they brought Augusta County, which is Lexington, Stanton, and that became known as Little Ireland. Now the interesting about this, we're going to talk about the settlement of this area. These Scots-Irish, it came to William Penn and said, we want some land in Pennsylvania. He says, fine, we got lots of it. Only this really nice land over here is guaranteed to the Indians by treaty. You can settle anywhere you want, except do not go to that Indian country. They being Scots-Irish, that's exactly what they did. They went and settled in this land that was reserved to the Indians. You'll recognize some of the names of these people. There were Gilmores and Gilmers, which is the same name. Big Stone has had 2 Dr. Gilmers. There are 5 Gilmers who have gone to MCV and have made doctors. The other name that you'll recognize that came from this route were the Dickinsons. The country is full of Dickinsons. Dickinson County and the Dickinson around Big Stone are folks from this bunch. So they got kicked out, actually run out of Pennsylvania, and settled in the Irish Tract at a place that originally was called Tea Creek, which is 6 miles to the northwest of Lexington. And the name changed to Carr's Creek. That's spelled with a K, K-E-R-R. You think it's Kerr, but it's Carr. That just happens to be on the main Indian route from the head of the James River to the Midwest. And the Indians became very upset about this. But they stayed there and multiplied. And the English also sent settlers over into the Greenbrier. And the next settlement was Draper's Meadow, which is VPI campus. That was next settled by the Irish under Colonel Patton, who was from the Irish tract. And you'll recognize some names there, Harmons and Castle, spelled in German with a K-A-S-S-E-L-L, sometimes in English with a C-C-A-S-S-E-L. The stadium at Tech is Castle Stadium. That's no accident. We had 2 members, Bill and I, in our class, Mike and Stu or Ken Castle, who were from that bunch. They spell their name with a C-C-A-S-S-E-L. And there's another member of that family from Draper's Meadow who spelled his name English way as Castle, C-A-S-T-L-E, who in 1750 moved to what's now Castlewood, Virginia. The next place of settlement has got a longer history on it, which I think, if we're talking about our heritage, the Germans had just been involved in a very bloody war, the 30 Years' War, and it had killed 70% of the civilian population of a town called Schriesheim, which is on a tributary of the Rhine River, and there's a waterfall there, and it's a mill town. They built a water mill, and for that whole part of Germany, ground wheat and an industry developed around there. And the family that owned the mill was family named Mock, M-O-C-K in German. And he looked around at the carnage of what was going on and says 70% of the civilian population here died. We've got to have a better way of living than this. We're going to form our own religion, and it's going to be pacifist. We're not going to fight under any conditions, and we're going to not have this combination of religion and state. We're not going to have state religions, because all these wars that's going on are due to these two factors. It's believing in military might and having state religions, and we're going to do away with state religions. Now, all the countries in Europe did exactly the opposite. They all came together into a common state, and they believed in a common religion. If you didn't belong to their religion, you had to leave. So these people had to leave, and they emigrated to Pennsylvania and built a colony, really a commune, just outside of Philadelphia. They named Ephrata. Ephrata is now a state park in Pennsylvania. These communal barracks are still there, and they're a state park. And this went very well until MECC, or Mach, it's Mach in German, it became MECC in English, until he died. And these folks got into a fight over succession, just like the Muslims did. And they really got bad, and the son of Mach says, I'm leaving. We left Europe to get away from fighting, so we're leaving. And there's a written record that Ephrata divided, and part of them went into the wilderness. Nobody knew where that was for 100 years. And it turned out to be under Crater Lake. These folks believed in total immersion, the baptism by total immersion rather than by sprinkling. And the Middle High German word for immersion, like immersing a donut into a cup of coffee, Dunkin' Donuts, was Duncan. And these folks that settled in the bottom under Crater Lake became known as Dunkards. And all these exiles settled in this bottom land, which became known as Dunkard's Bottom. They also came further into Washington County and settled at Mack's Meadows. Mack's is a further corruption of Mach. It's Mach's Meadows. And they also, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. Well, all these folks were confronted, all these settlements I'm talking about, were attacked by the Indians in the opening stages of the French and Indian War. The first thing they did was hit Draper's Meadows, VPI, and killed Colonel Patton, who was bringing in gunpowder. He was unloading gunpowder, and they shot him, killed him. He's the most prominent European American ever killed by the Indians. You forget Custer. Custer, only prominence. Nobody would have ever remembered Custer if he hadn't got himself killed. But Patton owned most of the Valley of Virginia under the Loyal Company, which was a grant from King George II. The next thing they did, they attacked the Dunkards in Dunkard's Bottom, which is Radford, Craters Lake. And they're pacifists. We ain't going to fight. So they ran into North Carolina. Now, where they ran into was the Yadkin Valley, Winston-Salem, Raleigh-Durham, which had been occupied by the Catawbas. The Catawbas had been completely wiped out in 1740 by smallpox. The Yadkin Valley was entirely vacant, but the Mennonites and Brethren settled there. And there were a lot of people left from the Spanish who had settled there just prior to the Spanish Armada. They settled there in 1887, and they intermarried with the Cherokee. Now they were observed to be, this is written in history, they were observed to be in Dunkard's Bottom. There were white people who dressed like Indians and acted like savages who lived with the Cherokee in Dunkard's Bottom. They ran into Yadkin Valley. Now I haven't mentioned to you, but there were two prominent folks living in what's now Chilhowie. James Patton, who lived in Draper's Meadow, Blacksburg, built a house there and had a trading depot in Chilhowie. There was another man who lived down on the Holston River, about half a dozen miles away, who was Irish, and his name was St. Clair, to say it in clear English. The Irish didn't pronounce it that way. They pronounced saint as sin, and they called him Sinclair. And that's where the surname Sinclair, like Sinclair gasoline, St. Clair's Bottoms. Now he was a trader with the Cherokee and the Shawnee, and the warpath runs from Chilhowie to the Yadkin Valley by what's now Mountain City, Damascus Mountain City, through Trade, which is the gap between North Carolina and Tennessee. It's the oldest settlement in Tennessee. Chilhowie was the westernmost settlement in Virginia during the French and Indian War, and it was occupied by these two settlers. And the one in Chilhowie proper was a German from Draper's Meadow. His name was Stahlnacher. And Sinclair. Now, nobody on the frontier was more highly valued by the Indians than the traders. They often married them off to the most prestigious women in the tribe. So the first thing they did was raid Chilhowie. The Shawnee came down from Chillicothe, Ohio, and they took Stahlnacher into protective custody. That's what they called it. They killed his wife, took him up to Ohio and married him off to an Indian woman. And Sinclair went back to Glasgow, which is a town on the mouth of what's now the Maury River, which is Lexington, into the James. And the Shawnee under Chief Cornstalk, who lived in Chillicothe, remember this is the allied with the Mingo. Chief Cornstalk conducted the first of 3 raids into Carr's Creek. And he killed lots of folks. He killed Gilmers and he killed Dickinsons. And then he went back to Ohio. And the French and Indian War ended by the British Navy, which conquered Louisburg, which is the biggest fort in North America the French had built as the first ice-free port near the mouth of St. Lawrence. The St. Lawrence would freeze solid every year. So their ice-free port was in Nova Scotia at Louisburg. And Louisburg guarded the mouth of the St. Lawrence, which was where Montreal and Quebec City were. So after a really big fight, the British Navy reduced Louisburg, and the Indians were the first to realize that meant the end of the French. The French were slow to learn, but the Indians deserted the French. And then the Navy sailed up the St. Lawrence and landed British Marines at Quebec City. And the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, which was just outside of Montreal. It was where both commanders were killed, but the French lost the French and Indian War at that point. So the French and the English in Europe decided that the war was over. It was decided the English had won the French Empire in North America. They'd saved Virginia. They drew a peace treaty and ended the war. The only trouble is nobody told the Indians. And the Indians didn't know about the treaty, and even if they had known about it, they didn't care anything about it because the English took over the French forts. And they hated and feared the English worse than the French because the English weren't native friendly like the French were. So even though history books will tell you that the French and Indian War ended, it didn't. What we call Pontiac's Rebellion. Pontiac was the chief of the Indians under the French. And Pontiac raided Detroit and Pittsburgh. And the Indians almost drove the English out of the whole northeastern United States. And Cornstalk began to raid Tea Creek or Carr's Creek again so they could open up the avenue into the Valley of Virginia. The second raid there of Carr's Creek. And then there was a third raid of Carr's Creek led by Cornstalk. Now this was the beginning of what you were taught. The first time you were taught anything about what I've been talking about was Lord Dunmore's War, where Lord Dunmore, the last royal governor of Virginia, in 1774 led the Virginia militia to attack the Shawnee. And the Shawnee knew all about it, and they ran toward Virginia out of southern Ohio. And the Virginia militia left Fort Frederick, which is a militia fort at Dunkard's Bottom. Now, if you know that bridge that crosses the New River to south of Radford, there's a double bridge on Interstate 81. Fort Frederick was right under the bridge on the north side of the bridge. And the Virginia militia decided to attack the Shawnee in Ohio in retaliation for the Shawnees attacked at Draper's Meadow where Patton was killed. And they said, we're going to be smart about it. We're not going to go down the New River, which is the way the Shawnee came in, because the Shawnee will know we're coming. We're going to go this back way. And that back way involved going down through Tazewell, Virginia. They went through Burke's Garden, into Tazewell, into North Tazewell, and into the town of War, West Virginia, which is named after the creek there, which is War Creek. War Creek flows into the Kanawha River near Williamson. And it was the middle of winter, and they got into boats and floated down War Creek from War, West Virginia. And their canoes with all their supplies swamped. They lost most of their gunpowder, most of their food, and Colonel Lewis from Salem was in charge of this expedition. Wouldn't let them stop. They had a rebellion, a mutiny. Lewis told them, kill your horses, we'll eat them, and we'll still go on to Ohio. And the Virginia militia mutinied and started back toward War, and most of them starved to death or died of pneumonia. And they were so hungry that they decided to eat their harnesses on their horses. Now their harnesses on their horses and saddles were handmade and held together with strips of rawhide. And these strips of rawhide they called tugs. They called tugs. And they survived off this rawhide, off their saddles. And the branch of the Big Sandy River where this happened became known as the Tug Fork because of this. And they barely made it back to Fort Frederick, but that's the Tug Fork. Now, what are the practical results of all this? One is we lost all the Indians between the Mississippi and Newfoundland. There are reservations, but they're all basically Caucasian. Just like the Cherokee, you cannot find the Cherokee gene in the Cherokee in Cherokee, North Carolina. They mostly come from the Spanish. And the same thing is true all up and down the northeastern United States. Another thing is the English never really got over this idea that the frontier was a line drawn on a map. The French and Indian War, the treaty that ended the French and Indian War, drew a line down the map, and it was the western bank of the New River. They were careful to include the lead mines at Austinville, which were the most important source of lead, think bullets, in the United States. Drew a line down the river and said, this is the frontier. And the idiots actually believed it. I'm talking about the English. Now, all this frontier that I've been talking about, I didn't tell you that when Christopher Gist went to Ohio in 1750 to visit the Shawnee, that's when he discovered Guess River and Guess Mountain and all this business. Christopher Gist spent the winter of 1751 with the Shawnee and left a journal. He wrote a very nice journal. But the Shawnee in Ohio were filled with French Canadians. They even had a French Canadian blacksmith. Now that should change your idea of what the Indians were like. Their economy, their culture supported a blacksmith. There was iron in Ohio and a blacksmith, and a man needed to turn iron into useful implements. We'd never suspect that. But the Europeans were as far west as Chilhowie, and in fact, the Europeans were married in with the Cherokee all the way into to Knoxville, into Cherokee, North Carolina. When the treaty that ended the French and Indian War, George III reneged on George II's sale of land in the Valley of Virginia to the Germans and Scots-Irish. He said, we're going to have to pacify the Indians so we don't have any more French and Indian War. The English won the French and Indian War, but it almost bankrupted Great Britain. So to pacify the Indians, we're going to give them all the land west of the New River, which was already heavily settled. Heck, Hungry Mother Park, Hunger was not Middle German, but Old German. There are three types of German. Old German, for starvation. Hunger is starvation. And the only other place in Virginia you'll find that word is on the eastern shore opposite Tangier Island. There's a Hunger's Creek and a Hunger's Parish Church that nobody over there knows where the word hunger comes from. But it's Old German. And if you look at the land grants, and there are two of them, for Marion, Virginia, they're on Hunger's Mother's Creek. That tells you two things. And the Germans who settled Pennsylvania spoke Middle High German. All these folks who went to the Yadkin Valley, Middle High German. But here is an Old German word popping up in Marion. So that tells you that the Germans had penetrated as far as Marion. It tells you something else, because it didn't say it was Hunger's Creek, it was Hunger's Mother's Creek. In other words, this Indian woman. And it had to be an Indian woman because the only people around here who were female and head of household were Cherokee. So Marion was founded by a Cherokee woman who had taken her husband's name, who spoke Old German, Hunger. So there were people in here even before the story that I'm telling you. So King George III said, I'm going to repossess all this land that all these people paid silver, sterling silver for, that went as far as Bluff City. The land around Bluff City, Tennessee was sold by James Patton, the loyal English company. They paid silver for it, sterling silver. George III said, we're going to take it all back and give it to the Indians. And that was the root cause of the Revolutionary War in Virginia. And don't forget, Virginia was the largest and most influential colony among the 13. Forget all this Yankee propaganda about Stamp Act and things like that, and T-tax. It began in Virginia over the treaty that ended the French and Indian War. These settlers got so upset, they made war on Great Britain over it. When the Virginia militia came back from the Battle of Point Pleasant and Lord Dunmore's war, they marched straight to Boston, which was in 1775, a year after the battle. But they never stopped. They went straight to Boston because they were ready to make war on Great Britain. And it was over this confiscation of land, which was done as a result of the treaty that ended the French and Indian War. All these people who got run out of these various settlements that I've talking about went into the Yadkin Valley. And in 1771, the Yadkin Valley folks got into a pitched war with the Tidewater people of North Carolina. Again, it was a Scots-Irish, German versus high-class English conflict. Churchill, who actually understands this better than any other historian, has got this written in his History of the English-Speaking People. He understood it better than anybody, but they made war on the English, and the English redcoats and them fought it out at the Battle of the Alamance. And the settlers from the Yadkin Valley were winning the battle until they ran out of gunpowder. And the English settlers marched into the Yadkin, burning courthouses, hanging these people were called regulators because they wanted to regulate the government. They hanged everyone they could get. They announced they were going to hang them all. And these regulators, who were the mix of these folks who came from Virginia and the Spanish settlers, went in a stampede in the largest migration of people in the history of North America. They came through every pass in the Blue Ridge they could find, mostly mouth of Wilson and up 421 into what's now Kentucky, excuse me, Tennessee. Okay. Do you want me to continue? Came into Virginia because they were going to get hanged. And these regulators came into Southwest Virginia because of their intermarriage with Spanish. They acquired a curly hair and dark complexion and were called Melungeons, which is Arabic word which means mixed people. And Southwest Virginia is full of them, and I should say we're full of them because I think any family that's lived here since the time of the Revolution has got that Melungeon heritage in them, whether they know it or not. That was a direct result of the French and Indian War and this chaos we're talking about. The people in Tennessee had already halfway decided that they no longer belonged to Virginia. After all, the English under King George III that said you're not English if you're living down there. So they moved into Tennessee, and under John Sevier, who was a French-Canadian Virginian whose name was Eugene Xavier, got all these folks into a military unit and a political unit and formed the state of Franklin, which they said was independent of the United States and independent of Virginia. this all started with this line of demarcation where the English drew a line down the map. People in Washington County, Abington, Saltville, who had paid silver sterling to the crown to own their land, walked off and left it, absolutely pissed off against Virginia and the United States, and formed their own state, when state meant country, didn't mean province. And Virginia militia under the Virginia militia went down and made war on these folks and beat them, and John Sevier was declared to be a traitor. Martin, General Martin, Joseph Martin. And that started what continues to this day, some acrimony between Tennesseans and Virginians. We all know it exists. I won't talk about it. There was a great publicity stunt about 30 years ago when some lawyers decided they would have a rebirth of the great state of Franklin. They got together and elected a governor and a lieutenant governor, and they were going to use this as a political ploy to milk money and attention out of Richmond and Nashville. So the great state of Franklin was a result of the French and Indian War.